Okay. New lesson. But same book, Mathew.
Which Matthew?
The first one in the New Testament. The tax collector.
Which chapter?
27.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Just wanted to make sure.
Last week we were talking about the so-called trial, right? You know, and we skip over a lot of stuff going up to today's lesson, right? You know, Jesus was taken to Pilate, and and Pilate didn't realize that he was actually the one on trial, and he failed, right? And then they scourged him big time, and then they released Barabbas. And in verse 29, it says, they put a crown of thorns on his head, and they spit on him, right, and began to beat him, right, and mocked him, took his robe off and put garments on him, and led him away to be crucified. Verse 32, they were coming out, they found a man of Cyrene named Simon, whom they pressed into service to bear his cross. What else do we know about Simon of Cyrene? Anybody remember anything about him or his sons, Rufus, and what was his other son's name? They're mentioned later in Paul's letters. That so they apparently became Christians as a result of this crucifixion and resurrection, and he had just arrived in Jerusalem, had no idea what really was going on, and all of a sudden he's got to carry the cross. Right? In 33, when they had come to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, right? Golgotha is the Aramaic, right? We get the word Calvary from the Latin for the same word. Okay? So if somebody was to say Calvary is not in the Bible, you could say, yes, it is, in the Latin form. Just like people say that I'm having another senior moment, Jerry. When we're all sucked up off the earth, the rapture, right? They tell you that the word rapture is not in the Bible. But it actually is in the Latin. The word rapture comes from the Latin word raptura, I think it is, right? And so it actually is in the Latin version. That's where we get the word rapture from, because the English comes predominantly from Latin, right? Anyway, so they take him to the place of the skull, which could be that because they've killed a lot of people there and there's a lot of skulls around. Or because, it kind of looks like a skull from the side, so whichever reason they call it that. In 34, they gave him wine to drink mingled with gall, and after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink it. They were giving him something to null his senses, and he's like, nope, I'm taking on the whole deal, right? When they had crucified him, they divided up his garments among themselves, casting lots.
That was supposedly 9 a.m., right?
Yep. Has anybody ever read Psalms 22?
While that.
We might get into this when we get into the new quarterly, right? Psalms 22:1. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Right? And I'll drop down to verse 11, right? Be not far from me, or trouble is near, for there is none to help. Many bulls have surrounded me, strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. They open wide their mouth at me, and a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, verse 14, and all my bones are waxed out of joint. Right? My heart is like wax, it is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd. My tongue cleaves to my jaws, and thou dost lay me in the midst of, in the dust of the death, where dogs have surrounded me. The band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. Right? I can count all my bones. They look and stare at me. They divided my garments among them. For my clothing they cast lots. Right? And there's also in here in 22 where it says, that God, as we'll talk about in a minute, that if God cares about him, he'd help him and whatnot, right? We'll get down to that, right? So, once again, we get Psalm 69:21 from verse 34, Psalms 22:18 from verse 35, and sitting down they began to keep watch over him there, Psalms 22:17, and he put up above his head the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." Right? Now, what did the leaders of the Jewish people say? The Sanhedrin and the chief priests, what did they say when they put that sign up, which is up in 3 languages, by the way? It's a pretty good sign, I guess. In 3 languages, this is Jesus, King of the Jews.
He says.
Yeah, they said, no, say he says. All of a sudden, Pilate gets some nerve, though, and says, I've written what I've written. So, they could not stop God's plan of identifying who this was, right? The sign was correct. At that time, 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. So where's Jesus? In the middle. He's being crucified with sinners, right? Isaiah 53:9.
Well, by definition, if you're being crucified, you're a sinner. Duh.
The point being in the middle, he's supposed to be the chief sinner of the ones being crucified. Yet Jesus had committed no sin. But he's there for a purpose, isn't he?
The Romans were very good at
Killing people.
They'd
Yeah.
line them up on the highway,
Yep.
and for miles there'd be people hanging on. I don't know how they dealt with the older.
Well, and they didn't. And Nero even lit them on fire to light the way.
Roman candles,
Yeah. Right? They were good. They were very good at killing people, which is one of the reasons when Jesus is resurrected, those who say that he wasn't dead, you're telling the Romans they don't know how to kill people? They knew what dead was. Right? So, Jesus being crucified with sinners, Isaiah 53:9. When was Isaiah and Psalms written? How many hundreds of years before this, right? And in Isaiah 53, we have this very accurate description of crucifixion, which was written before crucifixion was even invented. At the time, there was no such thing. Nobody did it. The Romans got it from somebody, I forget who started it. But somebody else started, the Romans picked it up, and then of course they used it a lot, right? In Jewish custom, if somebody was to be killed, how was it done? Stoned. Right. Right? So, if somebody was to say that, going back to Daniel 9, that the Messiah is going to be killed, they would assume he would be stoned. They would not even, of course at the time there was no such thing as crucifixion, right? But yet Isaiah writes a very accurate description of crucifixion in Isaiah 53, showing us exactly what was going to happen to the Messiah, right? And those passing by were hurling abuse at him, wagging their heads. Psalms 22:7. All the scriptures that were fulfilled in these actions that Jesus went through, right? And keep in mind though, remember Jesus is there of his own free will. Nothing anybody could do to stop him if he wanted to not do it, right? He had to surrender himself and go through this voluntarily, or it would never have happened.
Yeah, he said, I could call down a legion of angels and wipe you all out here and nothing flied.
12 legions of angels. 12 legions of angels, you know, right? Of course, he could have just invented more angels if he wanted to. He called them into existence, and right? You know?
That would have been a freak out. People just popping up out of
Well, that's going to happen here in a minute. Right? So it's amazing the number of scriptures, prophecy fulfilled by Jesus Christ. You know, and when you do the statistics on it, it's absolutely overwhelming that Jesus was the Messiah. You cannot study those numbers and conclude anything else. Because if you just take 8 of them, according to John, what's his name, wrote More Than a Carpenter. In his book, I can't think of his name. That'll come to me in a minute, right? But in his book, you just take 8 of them, and the math comes out to 40 trillion to 1, right? Which is like 1 electron out of the entire universe, right? You know, so the odd, that's only 1 out of over 300 that he fulfilled, right? And saying, you who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. He could have. What kept him on the cross?
What?
What kept Jesus on the cross? Why did he stay there?
Because he was God and one he had a purpose and he wasn't going to break his purpose.
Yeah. I have a simpler answer for you, right? Love. He loved us enough to go through this for somebody as worthless as me. It's mind-boggling that God, who spoke into existence the heavens and the earth, I mean, with just by speaking, somebody that awesome would go through this.
You know, that's I guess probably the biggest impediment to people's belief is what you just said, speaking it into existence. That just, because our minds can't handle that. We don't understand that.
Nope. Nope.
Because we've seen the stratuses of the rocks, and all you gotta do is go down through, you know, whatever that place is where,
Grand Canyon.
no,
Oh.
I was thinking about, on Highway 35.
Oh.
Where the camp is. That whole area is a terrible upheaval. And there's layers and layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of rocks and various things in there.
Mm-hmm. All proving that Noah's flood was true. You know, the space between the layers are too small. You know, the Grand Canyon proves that it was made by the flood. Absolute proof that it was made by rapidly, right? Not by time after time. You look at the layers and they don't add up. There would be thicker layers between the other layers if there had been millions of years and all that gobbledygook they'd tell everybody, right? And there's not. It's layer upon layer. It happened real quick. Mount St. Helens that blew up in 1980, another proof of what can happen in a matter of just a few hours, you know. These petrified trees and stuff, you know, that people say, oh, it had to happen over millions of years. No, it didn't. It happened in about 3 hours, right?
You know, when St. Helens blew up, that was really an extraordinary event.
It was.
But I've hiked that mountain. I've
Have you?
climbed it 2 or 3 times. But you can start at the very top of it and slide on your pants all the way to the parking lot.
Oh, really?
And it's about 6,000 feet.
I was going to say that'd be a long ways down.
We did that, you know. Everybody would, our group would put leather on their pants.
Yeah. Yeah, otherwise you
So,
wore out your butt by the
yeah.
time you get to the bottom.
That's exactly. It's extraordinary. And of course, it's gone.
Yeah, now. Phew. Right. All right. So he's on the cross. They're telling him, if you're the Son of God, just come on down. What are they looking for? They're looking for a miracle, right? Jesus already gave us a parable about people who only believe because they see a major miracle. That's not faith, right? He's looking for people of faith. That's not faith.
Well, I always thought, considering all the miracles he did up to this point, if he provided them one, they probably still wouldn't believe
They wouldn't believe it. That's exactly right. In the same way, the chief priest, plural, so that would include the current and former, you know, Caiaphas and Annas and maybe others, right? Also, along with the scribes and the elders, were mocking him. Now, what is this day? The first day of unleavened bread. This is the Passover begins in the evening, right? And what are they supposed to be doing? They're supposed to be preparing the sacrifice. And that's got to happen at 3 o'clock. And here it is that morning, and they're out there wagging their heads, thinking they're big shots. Look what we did to you, ha, 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 right? Yeah, you said you were the Son of God, Is there any doubt that they knew what he said? Come on down, just come on down from the cross, and we'll believe you. Yeah. Mockers like that, He saved others in verse 42. He cannot save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him now come down from the cross and we shall believe in him. Ha ha. They're just being sarcastic. All right? They don't realize he could have come down. He didn't even have to come down. With a thought, he could have turned them into vapor. But what's he doing? Like I say, because of his love for man that he created, he stays on the cross, paying the price for all sin, for all people, for all time, including those that were mocking him. All they had to do was actually believe. And there were so few of them, of the Jewish leadership. We know of a few, right? Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, that believed, right? But there weren't very many. They didn't like the way he was upsetting their apple cart. And that made them so mad they were blind. Now, remember, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders would be like the Sanhedrin, right? So the big shots, the teachers of the law, the people who knew the scripture the best, and they're seeing this happen. They knew about Psalms 22. They knew about Isaiah 53, etc. They knew. And yet it did not occur to them that he was fulfilling those scriptures. If anybody should have realized it, it would have been them. But when you get so much sin in your heart, you're just blinded to the truth. And that's where they were at.
And they weren't expecting a common person either.
No, they're expecting God,
Yeah.
right? And Jesus said, I am he. I am the Son of God, right?
Which
I
you-
am deity.
But you don't look like
And
God.
yeah, you don't look like God to me. How can you be God? So I'm going to judge you. The judge of the universe, you're going to judge? You have that kind of intelligence? Obviously not. You got it all wrong, right?
He probably had body odor like everybody else.
Well,
Well, since he was 100% man, I firmly believe that's true, right?
he probably even had nosebleeds.
Right. But that's also Psalms 22:6, along with 69:9. You know, he trusts in God. Let him deliver him now if he takes pleasure in him, for he said, I am the Son of God. Psalms 22:8. Same thing, just said if he trusts in God, right? And so, and here they are. They're now fulfilling the scripture that they should have known. It's coming out of their mouth. And they don't realize it. And the robbers also who had been crucified with him were casting the same insult at him. Robbers, both of them. Now we know that one of them changes his mind, right? Later he's like, Jesus, you know, remember me when you come into your kingdom, right? One of them wised up, hanging on the cross. That's what you call last minute salvation, right?
Yeah.
He's about to die, you know, knows it, and realizes that, wait a minute, this guy didn't do anything.
See,
Not like we did.
We would say I made it by the skin of my teeth.
Yeah. Yeah. Right? And what's unique about that guy? First one in heaven, right? After the resurrection, he says, today thou shalt be with me in paradise. Right? Okay, verse 45. Now from the 6th hour, what time is that?
Oh,
3 o'clock?
Be noon.
No,
noon is
6th hour is noon. Remember, day starts at 6. 3rd hour is 9, 6th hour is noon. Darkness fell upon the land until the 9th hour. Why? What caused the darkness?
he was dying.
well, the sun was shadowed somehow.
Somehow, right? When you have an eclipse, when do they happen? Anybody know? And how long do they last? If this moon moves in front of the sun and it's eclipsed, when does it happen?
Days.
Always at new moon. It's called new moon, right? When is Passover? Always at full moon. Right? So that tells you it wasn't an eclipse. Secondly, how long does the eclipse last? No more than 5 minutes. Gone, right? 3 hours of darkness. How does that contrast with when Jesus was born? And the angels came. Right? Suddenly the heavens are lit, you know. In the middle of the night, the heavens are lit up, right? And the angels are singing. But now, there's nobody singing. And darkness comes over. And by the way, there are other people, such as, I wrote this one guy's name down, Heliopolis from Egypt, that recorded darkness even in Egypt. So the darkness was, I don't know how widespread, but if you get people as far away as Egypt talking about it, right? It's pretty good darkness.
What was that name again?
Heliopolis.
Heliopolis.
Heliopolis. Right? So this is, in essence, a miracle. God made it dark. Okay? Now, what's unique about the 9th hour? What did the Jews do on the night at the ninth hour? On Passover week. What was done on the ninth hour? It's when the lamb was slain. The one they brought into the house, right? They'd had it for a couple of weeks or whatever it was, and it became a pet, right? And now on this day, at the ninth hour, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, is when they kill it. Because they're going to eat it that night, right? At the ninth hour, right? 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus cried with a loud voice. Okay? Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Now, I have my own theory that God the Father and God the Son had never had any kind of separation, ever. And all of a sudden, God the Son is taking on the sins of the world. God the Father cannot allow sin in his presence. So God the Son and God the Father have a separation. And what's the first thing you feel if you're separated from God? Abandoned, right?
What?
Abandoned. Now, the other thing he's doing, right? He's quoting Psalms 22:1. In one of the crucifixion movies, there's people talking, he's calling Elijah, he's calling Elijah. And one guy says, no. Even now, hanging on the cross, about to die, he's quoting Scripture. All right. One of the best lines I ever saw in a movie. Even now. Who else would do that? If you were a fake, could you fake it right to your death like that?
I don't know, I haven't tried. But I don't think so.
You know, the old self-preservation thing kind of kicks in, and, you know, the lies kind of go out the window. You know, you can't keep up, you know, this facade you may have had. Jesus, of course, he doesn't have a facade. He's telling the truth. I am the Son of God, right? So he's quoting Scripture now. And some of those who were standing there when they heard it began saying, the man is calling Elijah. And immediately one of them ran, and taking a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed and gave him to drink. Psalm 69:21. And the rest of them said, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. Remember, they were expecting Elijah to come back as a precursor to the Messiah. So if you don't believe Jesus was the Messiah, you're still expecting Elijah. So they're thinking, well, maybe Elijah will come back and then we'll get all this explained. But Jesus told us that John the Baptist was the fulfillment of that scripture, of Elijah's return, making straight the path of the Lord, right? Okay? So that had already taken place. And then in verse 50, Jesus cried out again with a loud voice. And from John, we know what he said. It is finished. Now, if you're so weak, you've lost all this blood, you can't breathe, you've been hanging on the cross, right? You're struggling, and you're so weak that you're about to die, can you shout with a loud voice? Pretty hard, huh?
I haven't tried, but I don't think so.
No. Point is, Jesus
You
will
haven't tried
still...
it for a while.
Yeah, he hadn't been crucified lately. Jesus still in control. And he, quote unquote, yielded up his spirit. He yielded. He willingly died. He went through all of that, including the human side. Obviously the spirit didn't, right? Our spirit doesn't die when this body dies. It's going to one or two places, either with Jesus or not. And not is not good. He willingly gave up his spirit. The body died. Jesus was in control right to his death, right? Completely in control. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split. Anybody know how big the veil was?
I heard it was like about 8 inches thick and 65 feet tall or something.
Well, it was 30 feet tall, 60 feet wide, and was 4 inches minimum, maybe 6 inches, you know. It was a pretty heavy deal. Who was allowed to pass the veil and go into the Holy of Holies?
High priest.
The high priest. How often?
Once a
Once a
year.
year.
Once a year.
And they
Right.
tied bells on his,
Had a rope around his ankle, right?
Mhm.
Because nobody could go in and get him if he fell down or anything. They had to drag him out, right? You know?
and they wouldn't know unless his bells quit ringing.
But yet God tore it from the top to the bottom wide open. Now, what was theoretically inside the Holy of Holies? And I say theoretically because there's scripture that says that God left the temple, and I don't find any scripture that says he ever returned. Right? But inside was the presence of God at the mercy seat, above the Ark of the Covenant, between the cherubim, right? God was supposed to be right there, and was there until he left. When they rebuilt this temple, right, and then Herod expanded on it, I don't find any reference that says that God returned to the temple. Maybe he did. I don't know. But what did it symbolize if the curtain is no longer there?
No more separation between God and man.
That's right. Everybody now has access to God. Not just the high priest. Everybody has access to God. There is no more separation, right? You know, and like I say, from top to bottom, God did it. God reached down to man, right? And the earth shook. Another earthquake. And the rocks were split.
And it wasn't caused by oil drilling either.
No, it wasn't. Nope. They weren't doing much of that back then, right? And the rocks were split. Now, who is the rock? Jesus. So the symbolism that Jesus dying, being, quote, split, as the spirit and the body was split, right? The rocks split. Remember, just a few days before, on Palm Sunday, he enters, and the chief priests are saying, "Tell them to shut up," right? And he says if they did, the rocks would have to cry out. This was a big, big, big deal. Well, now you got a big, big, big deal going on here too, and the rocks were even split. The strongest thing they knew of, right? Okay? And the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. So the earthquake apparently opened up the tombs, apparently, right? And people who were dead are now alive. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many, like Jesus did after the resurrection.
I bet that created a stir.
You would think, wouldn't you? Yet when you look at all of the movies, crucifixion stuff, you know, about Christ, have you ever seen anybody talk about this? I never have. This had to be a big deal. Dead people walking around Jerusalem say, "Hey, how you doing?" And people are like, "What? I buried you last year."
Just went to your funeral the other day.
Yeah. What are you doing out here? Right? So I wonder what happened to them. We have no reference to how long they were there. You know, did they walk around until Jesus' resurrection, or did they walk around until Jesus' ascension? Maybe they followed him to heaven. We don't know. In God's infinite wisdom, he chose not to tell us what happened to them or how long they were there.
Which means
Right.
we don't need to know that right
We
now.
don't need to know. I mean, we know what Jesus did, right? And that's the one we follow,
Yep.
right? One more thing. The centurion, who is an expert at killing people, right? And those were with him keeping guard over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake and the things that were happening, they became very frightened and said, truly, this was the Son of God. The chief priests, who knew the scripture, wouldn't believe, but the Roman soldier realized what was happening. The darkness, the earthquakes, things like that just don't happen. He'd killed a lot of people. Nobody else had an earthquake or the darkness or any of that stuff, right?
Then they gave him money and said, don't tell this to anybody.
Well, not him, but the others.
Yeah, the others, when they
Right.
said
The
that.
guards that were there. He was there supervising the crucifixion, which he'd probably done hundreds of times. Right? Like you say, the Romans were really good at crucifixion. They knew what they were doing. They were very good at killing people. Any questions or comments on our lesson on the crucifixion?
Well, I'm glad I'm not a Roman.
I'm glad I'm not one of the elders in the Sanhedrin who did not get it.